The woman who walked away from the Mafia king. Every Sunday, the Romano crime family gathers inside their Long Island fortress, silk tablecloths, loaded guns beneath tailored suits, and smiles sharp enough to cut glass. For 11 years, Serena Holloway stood beside Don Lucian Romano as the quiet architect who transformed blood money into a billion-dollar empire that federal agents couldn't touch. But this Sunday, Lucian walked in with another woman on his arm and expected his wife to keep saving everything he was about to lose. He miscalculated. Because the moment Serena set her wedding ring down on that table, she didn't just walk out of a marriage. She pulled the pin on the most powerful crime family in New York. If you want to see how far one woman's silence was worth, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and don't move until this story is finished. Part 1. The roses on the dining room table had been arranged by someone who cared too much about appearances and not enough about the thorns. Serena noticed that every time she walked into the main hall of the Romano estate, the way the flower stems were stripped clean before being shoved into crystal vases, all beauty, no danger, exactly the image the family worked to project to anyone watching from the outside. She had spent 11 years learning to read this house the same way she read a contract, not for what it said, but for what it was carefully designed to hide. It was a Sunday in late October, and the light coming through the tall windows on the east side of the dining room was the color of old bone. Cold, flat, the kind of light that made everything look slightly less alive than it actually was. Serena stood near the sideboard, one hand resting on the polished mahogany, watching the household staff move in efficient silence. Plates carried at precise angles, wine poured without a sound, nobody making eye contact with anyone who mattered. She had trained herself years ago to feel comfortable in rooms where she was being watched without being acknowledged. It had taken longer than she expected, and it had cost her things she didn't fully understand she was losing at the time. The Sunday family luncheon was not optional. Donna Marcella Romano had made that clear from the first month of Serena's marriage, the same way she made everything clear. Not through direct instruction, but through the specific quality of her silences, and the way her eyes moved across a room like a general surveying ground she already owned. 11 years of those Sundays. 11 years of sitting at that table, listening to men who talked about loyalty the way they talked about weather, as something that existed around them, not something they were responsible for producing. Serena was wearing charcoal gray that morning, not because she had planned it as any kind of statement, but because it was the suit she had pulled from the closet at 6:15 when she was already thinking about the 3 restructuring files she needed to review before the end of the week. She did most of her real thinking before 7 in the morning, in the quiet of her private office on the 3rd floor, before the house woke up and filled with the noise of people performing their various roles. The files on her desk that morning concerned a subsidiary acquisition in Delaware that had been structured sloppily by a junior attorney 2 years before Serena had fully understood how deep the Romano family's legitimate holdings actually ran, and she was in the middle of rebuilding the legal architecture from the foundation up. She had been doing that in one form or another since her 2nd year of marriage. She heard the cars before she heard anything else. That was always how it worked at the Long Island estate. The gravel driveway curved long enough that you had maybe 40 seconds of warning before a vehicle reached the main entrance, and Serena had learned to use those 40 seconds. She could tell by the sound whether it was family, whether it was business, whether it was the kind of visit that required her presence or the kind that required her absence. She had developed that skill the way she had developed most of her survival skills inside this marriage. Not through anyone teaching her, but through the accumulated pressure of years of needing to know things she hadn't been told. 2 cars, moving faster than the usual Sunday arrival pace. She turned toward the window. The first car she recognized, Lucien's black SUV, the one he used when he wasn't trying to make an entrance. The second car was a silver Mercedes she didn't know. Not family, not attorneys. The plates were Manhattan, private registration, and the car had been driven by someone who handled it with personal familiarity rather than professional care. Small detail. The kind she was trained to notice. She straightened her jacket and walked toward the entrance hall. Donna Marcella was already there. The woman was 71 years old and stood as though the floor was grateful for her presence. She was dressed in her customary Sunday black, a string of pearls at her throat that had belonged to her own mother, and she wore the expression she always wore when she was already calculating something. Her eyes moved to Serena the moment Serena entered the hallway, and there was something in them that Serena couldn't immediately name. Not warning, not apology, something closer to preparation. That was the first thing. The front door opened. Lucien Romano entered in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and beside him, not behind him, not at a professional distance, but beside him close enough that the deliberateness was unmistakable, walked a woman Serena had never seen in this house before. She was beautiful the way certain weapons are beautiful, designed for impact. Dark hair worn loose, a silk dress the color of deep water, jewelry that had been chosen with the specific intention of being noticed. She moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to entering rooms that belonged to other people and finding them already familiar. Her hand was at Lucien's elbow, and she was not looking at Serena, which told Serena everything about whether she had known this moment was coming. Lucien looked at his wife. He had the face of a man who had rehearsed something and was now discovering that rehearsal and reality were not the same exercise. There was a beat, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, where the only sound in the entrance hall was the click of the woman's heels on the marble floor and the distant sound of someone in the kitchen dropping something ceramic. "Serena," he said. That was how he opened it, just her name. As if the name itself was supposed to do the work of explanation. She waited. "I want to introduce someone." His voice was steady. She had to give him that. 11 years of watching him maintain composure under pressure, and it had left its mark. He could say almost anything without his voice betraying the machinery working underneath it. "This is Bianca Vale." Bianca Vale turned to face Serena with a smile that had been built to be disarming and managed only to confirm that it had been practiced. "It's nice to finally meet you," she said. The finally was intentional. Serena understood immediately that the finally had been chosen to communicate a duration, a length of time that this situation had existed without Serena's knowledge, and she filed that information away without reacting to it. "Bianca will be joining us for Sunday lunch," Lucien said. He paused. "I'd like the family to get to know her." Behind him, 2 of his caporegimes had entered the hallway, Marco Ferrante and old Danny Corvo, who had been with Lucien's father before Lucien inherited the organization. Marco was looking at the floor. Danny was looking at Serena with an expression that might, in a different context, have been mistaken for pity. The dining room filled in the way it always did on Sundays, bodies finding their established places, the ritual of seating that communicated rank through proximity to the head of the table without anyone needing to say a word about it. Serena sat where she had always sat, to Lucien's right, and Bianca Vale was placed at Lucien's left, directly across from Serena, which was either an extraordinary act of thoughtlessness or an extraordinary act of deliberate cruelty. Serena's money was on the latter. Donna Marcella sat at the far end of the table and said nothing, which was how Serena knew she had known about this before today. The food was served. The wine was poured. The conversation moved with the practiced, slightly forced quality of a family determined to perform normalcy while something genuinely abnormal occupied the center of the table. Lucien's brother, Nico, talked about a property deal in New Jersey with the aggressive focus of a man trying to give everyone permission to look somewhere else. His wife, Julia, mentioned her daughter's school production and laughed too quickly at her own observation. Serena ate her food and participated in the conversation at the minimum necessary level and watched Lucien. He was watching Bianca. Not constantly. He was too disciplined for that. But there was a specific quality to the way his attention returned to her. Brief, involuntary, the way a compass needle swings north before someone grabs it and tries to point it elsewhere. Serena had spent 11 years learning how Lucien Romano directed his attention when he thought no one was cataloging it, and what she was seeing at that table had not appeared in their marriage for a long time, possibly ever. She understood then, with a clarity that had no sentimentality attached to it, that whatever she had been waiting for across 11 years of Sundays and silences and early mornings in her third-floor office had arrived. After the main course, Lucien set down his fork, which was the signal he used when he was about to say something he had decided mattered. The table quieted, not because anyone told it to, but because 11 years of Sunday lunches had trained everyone at that table to recognize what that gesture preceded. "I want to say something," he said, "to the family." Serena's hands were in her lap. She could feel the edge of the table against her forearm, the slight pressure of the linen napkin folded across her knees. Small, physical details. She focused on them the way she always focused on small details when something large was in motion. "Bianca is going to be a permanent part of my life," Lucian said. "I intend for her to be part of this family. I want everyone at this table to welcome her with the same respect they'd extend to anyone who holds that position." He did not look at Serena when he said it. That was the detail she would think about later. Not the words, not the presence of Bianca Vale, not the silence that followed, but the specific, deliberate choice Lucien Romano made to not look at his wife when he dismantled 11 years of her life in front of the people she had eaten Sunday lunch with for over a decade. Marco Ferrante coughed. Julia's hand had stopped moving. Old Danny Corvo was staring at the tablecloth as if it contained information of extraordinary importance. Donna Marcella sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, her pearls bright against her black dress, her expression arranged into something that was meant to communicate dignified acceptance and communicated instead the specific satisfaction of a woman watching a long game arrive at its conclusion. Serena picked up her wine glass and took one measured sip. She set it back down. She unfolded her napkin from her lap and placed it beside her plate with the unhurried precision of someone who had decided exactly what the next 2 minutes were going to look like. She stood up. She did not push back her chair with any particular force. She rose without drama, without tears, without the trembling that a room full of people watching for collapse might have expected. She reached into the inside pocket of her charcoal jacket and withdrew a white legal envelope, flat, sealed, carrying the embossed header of Vivian Ashcroft and Associates, which was a name that none of the people at that table recognized yet, but would know very well within 24 hours. She placed the envelope on the table. Then she removed her wedding ring. The diamond was 2.5 carats, Clarity VS1, set in platinum, selected by Lucian's personal jeweler based on a profile of what a Romano wife should wear. She had never chosen it herself. She placed it on top of the envelope with the same precision with which she set down a signed contract, at the center of her seat, not thrown, not dropped, just placed, as if it had always been a document rather than a promise. She looked at Bianca Vale for the first and only time since the woman had entered the house. "If she's truly worthy of standing beside the dawn," Serena said, her voice at its normal pitch, the same tone she used in conference rooms with men who had twice her legal experience and half her accuracy. "Let her save your empire." She walked toward the dining room door. No one spoke. The room was so quiet she could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant sound of a car on the road beyond the estate's perimeter. She walked through the door, across the marble entrance hall, and out the front of the Romano estate without stopping, without looking back, without giving anyone in that room what they were waiting for, which was the moment she broke. She did not break. Her car was parked on the east side of the house, her own vehicle, not one provided by the family, a detail she had insisted on years ago for reasons she hadn't fully articulated at the time and now understood completely. She sat in the driver's seat and held the steering wheel without starting the engine for approximately 40 seconds. Her breathing was even. Her hands were steady. She was aware of a sensation in her chest that was not grief exactly, but occupied a similar space, something being vacated, room being cleared for something that hadn't arrived yet. She started the car. She drove off the estate property and turned north on the main road. 11 minutes later, her phone began ringing. She did not answer it. Inside the dining room she had just left, the sealed legal envelope was being opened by hands she couldn't see. Inside, they would find the first layer of what Vivian Ashcroft had prepared. Not a full accounting, not yet, but enough. A list of the primary legal structures currently authorized under Serena Holloway's personal signature and professional guarantees, 17 of them, covering 9 separate corporate entities under the Romano Holdings umbrella, each one carrying a renewal or authorization window between 7 and 21 days, every single one of which required Serena's direct approval to maintain its current legal standing. Without her, they weren't structures anymore. They were exposure. She had not built that into the original architecture deliberately, or not entirely. It was more accurate to say that it was the natural consequence of 11 years of being the only person in a room who actually understood what they were signing. When you are the architect, When you are the one with the legal standing that makes the whole structure possible, your absence is not merely inconvenient, it is structural failure. The phone kept ringing. Serena turned onto the expressway heading toward the city and watched the Long Island landscape flatten and open in her rear-view mirror. She reached into the center console and found the second phone, the one she kept separate from the Romano family line, the one with a single contact saved under the name VA. She dialed. It rang once. "Tell me you're moving," said the voice on the other end. Vivian Ashcroft was 62 years old, had spent 35 of those years operating as one of the most respected and feared corporate attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard, and she answered her phone with the economy of someone who charged $450 per hour and had decided years ago that pleasantries were a form of billing fraud. "I'm moving," Serena said. "Good. I'm filing the freeze on the Ashcroft guaranteed authorizations in the morning. You'll need to be present at the Manhattan office by 8. I'll be there." How bad was it? Serena considered the question. Outside the window, the highway stretched ahead. The sky had gone from bone-colored to gray, and there was weather coming in off the water. She could feel it in the change of the light. "He didn't look at me," she said finally. When he said it, "He didn't look at me once." A pause. Not Vivian's typical kind. She wasn't calculating, she was allowing something. "Get to the city," Vivian said. "Get off the phone and drive. We'll do the rest in the morning." Serena put the second phone on the passenger seat and kept driving. Behind her, she imagined the estate and the specific chaos that followed any disruption to a carefully maintained order. She had watched it happen before, smaller disruptions, lesser cracks, and she knew what it looked like. The voices rising and then dropping as people tried to determine what had just happened. The frantic reaching for phones, the hurried consultation of attorneys who did not have enough information to be useful but were being paid to project confidence anyway. Marco Ferrante would be trying to read the envelope's contents with whatever legal comprehension he had, which was limited. Danny Corvo would be watching Lucien Romano's face with the survival instincts of a man who had spent 50 years determining which way a situation was going to break before it fully broke. Lucien would be calling her. He was calling her right now, probably. The main phone, sitting in her bag, was lighting up with a number she had memorized before she memorized her own mother's birthday. She reached into the bag, found the phone by feel, and without looking at it, turned it off. Not silent, off. She had been practicing that gesture in her head for 3 weeks. It turned out to be easier than she expected. What she had not practiced, what she had not allowed herself to map out in advance, because it contained too many variables that depended on things she couldn't control, was the question of what happened next. Not to her. She knew what happened to her. She had spent 3 weeks with Vivian, restructuring every authorization, every guarantee, every piece of legal standing that bore her name in connection with Romano Holdings, in a way that was entirely legal, entirely defensible, and entirely devastating to anyone who had assumed those structures were permanent simply because they had always been there. What she had not mapped was what happened to the other people. Not Lucien, not Donna Marcella, not Bianca Vale, who had walked into that house with the confidence of someone who believed she was inheriting something rather than adopting a set of obligations she did not yet understand existed. The employees. There were approximately 4,200 people who worked in legitimate roles across the Romano Holdings corporate structure. Accountants, logistics coordinators, HR managers, technology staff, restaurant managers, hotel personnel, commercial real estate administrators. People who had mortgages and children in school and performance reviews coming up, and absolutely no knowledge of where their company's legal infrastructure had come from or what it depended on. People who had done nothing wrong and who would suffer consequences for a collapse they had no part in creating. That was the variable Serena had been working around for 3 weeks, the thing that had kept her in Vivian's conference room until 2 in the morning on more nights than she wanted to count. Not how to protect herself. That part was straightforward, once she had decided to do it. But how to protect the thing the family had built on top of her work, the legitimate economic ecosystem that had grown up inside Romano Holdings over 11 years, without continuing to allow it to be used to erase her. The answer she and Vivian had arrived at was not elegant. It was not a single decisive move. It was more like surgery, cutting away the parts that were wrong without destroying the patient. The envelope on the dining room table was the incision. What came next would determine whether the patient survived. She drove. The skyline appeared on the horizon before she was ready for it, the Manhattan Towers coming into view against the gray sky like a sentence she had started a long time ago and was only now reaching the period of. She had grown up looking at that skyline from a different angle, from a different life, from a family that had been successful in ways that did not require anyone to disappear in the middle of the night. She had made choices that led her away from that life and into a different one. And she had made those choices for reasons that she had examined so many times over 11 years that they had become worn smooth like stones rubbed until they lost their edges. She had loved him at the start. That was a fact she didn't perform any revision on. She had loved Lucien Romano in the way that you love something when you are 28 years old and the world feels like it is organized around intensity rather than wisdom, when the dangerous thing and the desirable thing appear to be the same thing. She had loved him, and she had made herself useful to him, and somewhere in the distance between those two things she had disappeared. Not tonight. Not after 11 years and a Sunday lunch and a woman in a silk dress the color of deep water. The disappearing had been happening for a long time. What was different about today was that she had stopped. Her phone, the second one, the one still on, buzzed once. A text from a number she didn't recognize. A burner contact Vivian used when she needed to communicate something quickly without a paper trail. 3 words. They opened it. Serena felt the corner of her mouth move in something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the final click of a mechanism that had been assembling itself for 11 years. They had opened the envelope. That meant they now had the first piece of information they needed to begin understanding what the next 72 hours were actually going to look like. It also meant that Lucien Romano, the most feared organized crime figure on the East Coast, a man whose name made federal agents reach for their case files and rival families reroute their shipment schedules, was currently sitting at his Sunday lunch table holding a piece of paper that told him his empire had a problem he had not known existed and could not solve without the woman who had just walked out of his house. The city opened up around her as she came off the highway. She found a parking structure near the hotel where she had made a reservation 3 weeks ago. Not under her own name, not under anything connected to Romano, under a name that would mean nothing to anyone who went looking. And she sat in the car for a moment with her hands in her lap before she got out. The autumn air hit her when she stepped out of the garage onto the sidewalk, sharp and cold and carrying the particular smell of the city in October, which was wet stone and exhaust and something organic underneath both of those, something that reminded her she was in a place built for human friction rather than manufactured quiet. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed. From 17 floors above the city, in a suite she had reserved under a name that did not belong to her, she would be able to see the lights coming on as the afternoon collapsed into evening. She would call Vivian in the morning, and they would go to the office and begin the next phase of what had to happen. She would sleep tonight, or she would not sleep. But either way, she would still be here in the morning when the weight of what the Romano family was now facing became fully apparent to everyone who had spent 11 years taking for granted the ground she had built beneath them. But that was tomorrow. Right now, she was standing on a sidewalk in Manhattan with nothing in her hands, which was the lightest she had felt in longer than she could accurately measure, and the city was moving around her the way cities move. Indifferent, continuous, enormous, and she was not collapsing. She was not collapsing at all. Her second phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she recognized. Not Vivian, not the family line, but the direct cell of Richard Calloway, senior partner at Calloway & Bright, one of the 2 elite financial attorneys whose names appeared on the Romano Holdings restructuring agreements currently sitting inside Vivian's freeze protocols. She stared at the screen for a moment. She let it ring. Because they had finally found her phone number, the real one, the one she had kept entirely separate from everything. It meant they had done exactly what she expected, which was immediately reach out to every attorney connected to Romano Holdings in the hopes that one of them had a back channel to Serena. It meant the panic was already real, already moving faster than Lucien had anticipated. It meant the envelope had done what the envelope was designed to do. And it meant one other thing, which was the thing she hadn't told Vivian about yet. The thing she was still turning over in her mind like a piece of evidence she hadn't fully understood yet. Calloway wasn't a Romano attorney. Calloway operated at arm's length, a legitimate firm, fully above board, brought in for the specific purpose of providing the Romano Holdings corporate restructuring with independent legal credibility. He didn't call the family. He called the structure. If he was calling Serena directly, it meant the structure had told him to, which meant there was something inside Romano Holdings that knew enough to go directly to her rather than to Lucien. She thought about that. She looked at the Manhattan skyline the way she looked at a contract, searching for what was in it that she hadn't been meant to notice yet. The phone stopped ringing. A beat of silence. Then it started again. The hotel room was on the 17th floor and it smelled like industrial cleaning solution and recycled air, which was exactly what Serena needed. Something sterile, something that belonged to no one, something that carried none of the weight of the life she had just walked out of. She stood at the window for a long time after she arrived, still in the charcoal suit, shoes still on, watching the city move below her with the particular indifference of a place that did not know or care what had happened in a dining room on Long Island 3 hours ago. She did not order room service. She did not turn on the television. She sat at the small desk near the window with her second phone and the leather notebook she carried everywhere, and she worked, because working was the thing she knew how to do when everything else had become noise. And there was a great deal of noise right now. The calls had not stopped. Richard Calloway had tried 4 times, a number she didn't recognize, probably one of the junior attorneys at Romano Holdings' in-house counsel office, had tried twice. At 9:47 in the evening, a number she recognized as belonging to Nico Romano, Lucien's younger brother, appeared on the screen. She let it ring. At 10:15, Donna Marcella's personal line called. That one she stared at for the full duration of the ring cycle before it went to silence. She did not feel triumphant. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated, the absence of satisfaction. She had imagined, in the weeks of preparation, that there would be something clarifying about the moment of departure, some emotional settling that arrived alongside the decision. What she found instead was a strange flatness, a perceptual narrowing, as though her nervous system had decided that feeling anything right now was a luxury she couldn't afford and had quietly closed that door. She opened her notebook and wrote for 40 minutes. Not about Lucien, not about the Sunday lunch, not about Bianca Vale's hand at his elbow. She wrote about the Delaware subsidiary, the restructuring problem she had been working through that morning before everything else arrived. She wrote through the legal architecture problem with the same methodical attention she always gave it, following each structural issue to its logical conclusion, noting 3 possible resolution paths in the margins. It was not avoidance. It was more like breathing, the thing her system knew how to do when it needed oxygen. At 11:30, she turned off the light. She did not sleep well, but she slept. Vivian Ashcroft's office occupied the top 2 floors of a building on 53rd Street that had been designed in the 1960s with the specific intention of communicating that the people inside it were serious and did not particularly care whether you found the exterior welcoming. The lobby had marble floors, the color of old ice, and a reception desk staffed by a woman named Patricia, who had been with the firm for 22 years and whose primary professional skill was the ability to make anyone who entered feel simultaneously acknowledged and assessed. Serena arrived at 7:58. Vivian was already at the conference table with 2 associates, a financial analyst whose name Serena didn't know, and 4 separate stacks of documents organized with the precision of someone who had been awake since 5. She was wearing a dark suit and reading glasses, and she looked up when Serena entered with the expression she used when she was simultaneously relieved and already several steps ahead of the current moment. "Sit," Vivian said. Not unkindly, just efficiently. Serena sat. 3 things happened overnight, Vivian said, pushing a single sheet of paper across the table. First, Calloway and Bright filed an emergency consultation request with our office at 6 this morning, which tells us Lucien's people moved fast and understand the authorization problem clearly enough to reach for outside counsel before 9 a.m. on a Monday. Second, she pushed a second sheet. Romano Holdings issued an internal memo to all division heads at approximately 11 p.m. last night, suspending pending authorization on 4 separate acquisition transactions currently in negotiation, which means someone inside that organization understands that those transactions cannot proceed without your sign-off, and made the call to pause them before the counterparties noticed the hesitation. Serena picked up the first sheet. Calloway's emergency consultation request was written in the careful language of a man who understood that what he was documenting might eventually be read by people he hadn't anticipated. "Who's the someone?" she asked. "That's the third thing." Vivian took off her reading glasses and set them on the table. The internal memo was issued under the signature of James Whitmore. Serena went still. James Whitmore was the chief operating officer of Romano Holdings. He had been in that position for 6 years, brought in from outside the family structure specifically to provide the legitimate corporate operation with executive credibility that didn't carry the Romano name. He was 54, precise, professionally meticulous, and she saw this was the part that Serena was now recalibrating against. He had been copied on every major legal authorization Serena had executed over the last 4 years of her work inside the company's restructuring process. He had known. Not about Sunday, not about Bianca Vale, but about the architecture, about what depended on Serena and how completely. "He's trying to stabilize it," Serena said. "He's trying to buy time," Vivian corrected. "There's a difference. Stabilizing it requires your participation. Buying time only requires that he slow the bleeding until someone figures out whether you can be brought back to the table." She paused. "Can you?" "Not on the current terms." "I know that. I'm asking whether there are terms." Serena looked at the documents on the table. The second sheet, the internal memo, had Whitmore's signature at the bottom, clean and unhurried, the signature of a man who had decided what to do and done it without allowing himself to second-guess the decision. She respected that, in an abstract way. It was the same quality she tried to bring to her own decisions, and it was rare enough that she noticed it when she saw it in other people. "There are terms," she said. "Vivian already has them." Vivian allowed herself something that was almost a smile. "I wrote them at 2 a.m. I want you to read them again this morning with fresh eyes and tell me if anything changed overnight." Serena pulled the document toward her and read. She read carefully, the way she always read, not looking for what was there but for what was missing, for the gaps and the ambiguities, and the places where language that seemed precise was actually doing something evasive. The terms were largely what she remembered from the nights in this office working through them. But there were 2 clauses she read twice, one concerning the scope of independent audit authority over the family's legitimate holdings, and one concerning the permanent legal separation of Serena's personal guarantees from any future Romano Holdings transaction. Both were right. Both were, if anything, more protective than she had initially pushed for. Vivian had strengthened them overnight. "The audit scope," Serena said. "I expanded it. Lucien won't accept that clause as written." "Lucien Romano," Vivian said, "is currently sitting inside an empire whose legal protective structure has a 72-hour expiration window on 17 separate authorization instruments. He will accept what he has to accept." She picked up her coffee cup. "The question isn't whether he'll accept it. The question is whether he'll try something before he accepts it." That landed. Serena set down the document. "What kind of something?" "The kind that men like Lucien Romano try when they discover that a problem can't be solved with money or fear." Vivian's voice was flat, not dramatic. She was stating a professional assessment, not performing a warning. "You've walked away from his house, his name, and the legal infrastructure of his legitimate empire in the span of 24 hours. He is going to experience that as an attack before he experiences it as a consequence. And men who experience things as attacks tend to respond accordingly." Serena was quiet for a moment. The city outside the conference room windows was fully alive now, the Monday morning rhythm of 53rd Street moving at its particular compressed urgency. She watched a figure on the sidewalk below, too distant to be identifiable, just a shape moving with the specific purposefulness of someone who knew exactly where they were going, and thought about what Vivian was not quite saying. "You think he'll come at me directly," she said. "I think it's possible. I think it's more possible if he receives legal advice from someone inside his organization who frames this as an adversarial action rather than a consequence of his own choices." Vivian set down her coffee. "Which is why I want the terms delivered today, not tomorrow. Not after he's had 48 hours to work himself into a position. Today." "Through Whitmore?" Through Whitmore. Serena considered it. James Whitmore was not family. He was not loyal to Lucien in the way that Kappa regimes were loyal, through history and obligation and the specific calculus of men who had made choices together that they could never make public. He was loyal the way a professional is loyal, to the institution, to the function, to the thing that had hired him to do a specific job and allowed him to do it well. If the institution was at risk, Whitmore's loyalty would follow the most viable path to protecting it, which, right now, ran through Serena. "Set up the call," she said. Whitmore answered on the second ring, which told her he had been waiting for it. She had taken the call in one of the smaller conference rooms off the main floor, alone, with the door closed. Vivian had offered to sit in. Serena had declined. This was a conversation that needed to happen between two people who understood the same language, and Vivian's presence would add a formality that would make Whitmore perform caution rather than candor. "Ms. Holloway," he said. His voice was careful in the specific way of someone who had prepared what they wanted to say and was deciding in real time how much of it to use. "Mr. Whitmore, you issued the suspension memo last night." "I did." "That was the right call." A beat. "I thought so." The 4 transactions in negotiation, the Portland hotel acquisition, the 2 commercial real estate deals in Atlanta, and the Delaware restructuring, all of those have authorization windows. If they go dark for more than 10 business days without communication to the counterparties, 2 of them will walk. "I know," he said. "Portland won't wait past Friday." "Then you understand the timeline." "Ms. Holloway." He paused. She waited. "I've been COO of Romano Holdings for 6 years. In that time, I have processed or reviewed every major corporate transaction this organization has undertaken. I have worked with your legal authorizations on 43 separate instruments across 9 corporate entities." Another pause. "I knew what the company depended on. I don't think I fully understood until last night that I was perhaps the only person in this organization who did." Serena felt something shift in the room, subtle and important. "What does that mean, Mr. Whitmore?" "It means that when I went to brief Mr. Romano last night on the scope of the authorization problem, he was not," a careful pause, "he was not aware of the extent to which the company's legal protections were structured around your personal standing and guarantees. He understood that you had been involved in the legal work. He did not understand the degree to which the work was the thing holding the structure together." The flatness that Serena had been carrying since Sunday lunch developed a crack. Not grief, something colder. The specific cold of discovering that the erasure had been more complete than she had realized, that it was not simply that Lucien had undervalued her contributions, but that he had been operating in genuine ignorance of what those contributions actually were, that someone had kept him ignorant, that the management of his understanding of his own empire had been deliberate. "Who briefed him?" she said. Her voice was level. "On the legal structure?" "On my role in it." "Who was responsible for keeping him informed about what the authorizations actually meant?" Whitmore was quiet for 3 full seconds. "That would have been internal counsel," he said finally, "primarily through your brother-in-law's office." Serena's hand tightened on the phone. Nico Romano had been Lucien's liaison to the Romano Holdings legal operation for 4 years. She had worked alongside him at a professional remove, feeding authorizations and legal reviews through channels that passed across his desk before reaching Lucien. She had never had any specific reason to distrust the conduit. She had trusted the structure, as she had always trusted structure. Not because she was naive, but because she believed that properly designed systems were self-correcting, that the right architecture made corruption difficult even for people inclined toward it. She was recalibrating that belief right now. "Are you telling me," she said, keeping her voice in the same register she would use to discuss a contract clause, that Nico Romano was selectively filtering the briefings Lucien received about my role in the company's legal structure?" "I am telling you," Whitmore said, with the same careful precision, "that the gap between what Mr. Romano appeared to understand about the authorization structure and what that structure actually contained is significant enough that I cannot explain it through simple inattention." She stood up from the conference table. She moved to the window. Below on 53rd Street, the figure she had watched earlier was gone, replaced by a dozen others, all of them moving, none of them still. Nico Romano had spent 4 years managing the information that reached his brother about Serena's role in the company. 4 years of selective briefings. 4 years of reducing her to a signature at the bottom of a document rather than the architect of the document itself. 4 years of making sure that Lucien Romano understood his wife as an administrative function rather than the structural foundation of his legitimate empire. The question that arrived in Serena's mind was not why. She could see the why clearly enough. A brother who wanted to control the flow of power inside the family, who understood that Serena's real influence was a variable he needed to minimize, who had chosen the slow erosion of her standing over any direct confrontation because direct confrontation would have required acknowledging what she was actually worth. The question was not why. The question was what Nico Romano had known about Sunday. Had he known about Bianca Vale? Had he known about Lucien's plan to introduce her at the Sunday lunch? Had he... And this was the version that arrived fully formed, with a cold completeness that felt less like speculation and more like recognition. Had he been part of designing Sunday? Had the public humiliation been intended to produce exactly what it had produced, which was Serena walking out of the estate and triggering the authorization freeze that was now threatening to bring the legitimate empire down, so that Nico could then position himself as the person who understood the structure well enough to manage the crisis? She turned from the window. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I'm going to send you a document this afternoon. I need you to read it, and I need you to get it in front of Lucien Romano today, not through Nico's office, directly." A pause. "That's a complicated ask." "I know. Can you do it?" Another pause, longer. She heard him breathe. "Yes," he said, "I can do it." She ended the call and stood in the small conference room for a moment with the phone at her side, feeling the specific weight of a situation that had just become significantly more complex than the one she had walked into this morning. She had come to Vivian's office believing she understood the shape of what she was dealing with. She had understood Lucien, his pride, his blindness, his capacity for cruelty that came from thoughtlessness rather than malice. She had understood the authorization structure and what its activation would cost the family and what terms they would eventually have to accept. She had not understood Nico. She had not understood that she was not only dealing with the consequences of Lucien's choices, but potentially with the design of a man who had spent 4 years engineering the conditions for this moment. She walked back into the main conference room. Vivian looked at her once and set down her reading glasses. "What happened?" Serena told her. Vivian listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough that Serena registered it. When she finished, Vivian was quiet for a moment, looking at the document stack in front of her with the focused blankness of someone reorganizing a great deal of information very quickly. "If Nico designed this," Vivian said, "then the goal wasn't simply to replace you with Bianca Vale. No. The goal was to trigger your exit in a way that created a crisis that only he could manage. Yes. Which means the terms we've prepared, the independent audit, the compliance structure, the governance reforms, those terms directly threaten his ability to manage the crisis the way he intended." Serena sat down. "Yes. And if he's been filtering information to Lucien for 4 years, Vivian said, then Lucien receiving our terms directly through Whitmore, without Nico's framing, is a problem for Nico," Serena said, "and Nico will move to prevent it." They looked at each other across the conference table. "How fast?" Vivian asked. "Fast," Serena said. "He's been running this for 4 years. He's been waiting for it to land. He'll know by this afternoon that something went sideways when the terms reached Lucien unfiltered." Vivian picked up her phone and called Patricia at the front desk. "Get me building security on the line," she said, "and I want a car service arranged for Ms. Holloway that does not use the building standard vendor." She hung up and looked at Serena. "I want you to stay in this building until we know Whitmore has made direct contact with Lucien." "I'm not hiding, Vivian." "You're not hiding." Vivian's voice was patient and very firm. "You're staying in a controlled environment while a man who spent 4 years systematically erasing your significance to his brother's empire discovers that his plan has developed a complication. That's not hiding. That's just not being stupid. Serena held her gaze for a moment. Fine, she said. It was 2:17 in the afternoon when Whitmore called back. Serena was in the main conference room with the Delaware restructuring files spread across one end of the table, working because the work was still real even when everything around it was on fire. Vivian's associate brought her the phone with a look that communicated something had happened. Mr. Romano wants to meet, Whitmore said. His voice was different from the morning call, tighter, not with fear exactly, but with the specific tension of someone who had just moved through a room with a higher pressure differential than they had anticipated. In person. Tonight. Location? Romano Holdings, the main boardroom. A pause. Ms. Holloway. He came to my office. He came to me directly. He didn't go through Nico. Something moved through her chest. What did he say? He said... Whitmore stopped. She heard him exhale. He said he wanted to know how much of it was true. About the authorizations, about the scope of your work. Another pause. I told him all of it. Serena was quiet. He asked me, Whitmore continued, his voice lower now, why he didn't know, and I told him that I couldn't answer that question, but that I thought he should ask his brother. The silence that followed was the kind that contained a great deal happening inside it, without any of it being visible on the surface. Serena thought about Lucien Romano sitting in James Whitmore's office this afternoon, being told for the first time the actual scope of what his wife had built, and the specific quality of the silence that must have arrived in that room when the information settled. Tell him I'll be there, she said. There's one more thing. Whitmore's voice dropped another degree. Nico Romano arrived at the building 40 minutes ago. He went directly to the legal department. He's been in there since. Serena's jaw tightened. He was moving, exactly as she had predicted, and faster than she had hoped. He was in the legal department because that was where the documentation lived. The authorizations, the corporate instruments, the paper trail that showed the history of how information about Serena's role had moved through the organization and what had been emphasized and what had been omitted. He was in there because he knew that Lucien was now asking questions and he needed to get ahead of whatever answers the documents contained. Mr. Whitmore, she said, does legal have a document imaging and archival system? Yes, managed by an outside vendor. Who has access? Division heads and above. C-suite. And, a pause. Outside legal counsel with current authorization status. My authorization status, Serena said, is currently frozen but not terminated. Is that correct? A longer pause. That is correct. Then I need you to call your IT director in the next 10 minutes and have him initiate a full archive snapshot of the legal department's document management system, time-stamped, before anyone inside that department exports, deletes, or modifies anything. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that she thought the call might have dropped. Mr. Whitmore. I'm here, he said. I'm deciding something. Decide fast. Another beat. Then, I'll make the call. She handed the phone back to Vivian's associate and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the conference table, feeling the cool surface of it against her palms. The Delaware files were still spread in front of her. The afternoon light through the windows had shifted toward gold, the particular late-day light of October in the city, and somewhere across Manhattan, Nico Romano was in a legal department trying to get ahead of a story that had just developed a witness he hadn't planned for. She looked at Vivienne, who had been standing at the far end of the room, listening. He's not going to stop at the documents, Serena said. Vivienne nodded slowly. No, he's not. When he realizes the archive has been snapshotted, he'll know we know. And then he'll have to make a choice about what he does next, Serena said, between managing Lucien and managing me. He can't do both, Vivienne said. No. Serena stood up. He can't. She reached for her jacket, which was folded over the back of the chair. She picked it up and put it on without hurrying, smoothing the lapels the way she always smoothed them before she walked into a room that mattered. Her hands were steady. The flatness from the night before was still there, But underneath it, something else had arrived. Not anger, not exactly, but something with edges. Something that had been sharpened by the specific discovery that the humiliation she had walked away from on Sunday had not been the careless cruelty of a thoughtless man, but the deliberate architecture of someone who had been building toward it for 4 years. 4 years. She had been inside that house, in that office on the third floor, doing the work that kept the empire standing, and Nico Romano had been systematically reducing her to a signature, a function, a convenience, making sure that by the time Sunday arrived, Lucien would be able to believe that replacing her meant replacing a wife, when in reality it meant pulling the load-bearing wall out of the building. She was going to that boardroom tonight, and she was going to walk in with everything Whitmore's IT director was, right now, locking behind a time-stamped archive wall. 4 years of documents that showed exactly who had known what, and exactly what had been filtered, and exactly what the gap between Lucien Romano's understanding of his own empire and the reality of that empire actually looked like, and why. Not for revenge. She had meant what she said to Vivian about that weeks ago, and she still meant it now. But Nico Romano had spent 4 years making her invisible inside a structure she had built, and he was in a legal department right now trying to make sure she stayed that way, and she was done with invisible. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Manhattan area code. 3 words in the text field. Don't go tonight. She stared at it. Not Vivian's burner, not Whitmore, not any number she could place, and she was very good at placing numbers. The message was bare, no punctuation, no context, no sender identification. Just the 3 words sitting on her screen with the flat urgency of something that had been sent by someone who did not have time to be subtle and did not expect her to need them to be. Don't go tonight. She looked up at Vivian. Someone just told me not to go to the Romano Holdings boardroom tonight, she said. Vivian was already reaching for her own phone. Who? I don't know, Serena said. And that was the part that sat wrong. Not the warning itself, which she could reason around, but the not knowing. The existence of a number she couldn't place in a situation she had believed she had mapped completely. Someone knew where she was going tonight before she had agreed to go. Someone with a Manhattan number she had never seen, who had her private line, the second phone, the one she had kept entirely separate from everything connected to the Romano family, had sent her 3 words that meant either she had miscalculated something fundamental about tonight, or someone inside this situation was not who she had believed them to be. She looked at the message again. Don't go tonight. And then, as she was looking at it, a second message arrived from the same number, and this one was not 3 words but a name, a single name. And when she read it, the room seemed to contract around her, the golden afternoon light going flat, the sound of the city outside the windows suddenly distant, because the name on her screen was one she had not heard spoken aloud in 11 years, a name connected to a history she had believed was finished, and its appearance here, now, in this moment, meant that something she thought she understood about the shape of her own life was not the shape it actually was. The name on the screen was Daniel Holloway. Her brother had been dead for 11 years. That was what she had been told. That was what the death certificate said, issued by the state of New Jersey on a November morning 11 years ago, following a car accident on the turnpike that had left nothing identifiable enough to contradict the documentation. She had attended the memorial service. She had spoken to the detective who handled the case. She had held her mother's hand at the cemetery and felt the specific gravity of a grief that she had never fully processed, because she had married Lucien Romano 4 months later and moved into a world where grief was not a thing you were permitted to perform for very long. She stood in Vivian's conference room holding the second phone and read the name 3 times. Daniel Holloway. Not a message from Daniel Holloway. Just the name, sent from an unknown Manhattan number as if it were an answer to a question she hadn't asked yet. As if the sender knew that the name alone would be sufficient, that she would understand what it meant without any accompanying explanation, which meant the sender knew her well enough to know what Daniel Holloway meant to her, and knew that she would understand the name's appearance as a form of evidence rather than a coincidence. She was aware of her own breathing, the way it had changed. Not dramatically, not the visible disruption of someone receiving a shock, but a subtle deregulation, the body's involuntary acknowledgement that the ground had just shifted below a place where she had believed the ground was solid. Serena. Vivian's voice was careful, She turned the phone so Vivian could read the screen. Vivian read it. She looked up. "Who is Daniel Holloway?" "My brother," Serena said. "He died 11 years ago." Vivian held her gaze for a moment with the measured stillness of a woman who had spent 35 years in rooms where people said things that had enormous implications, and the correct response was to absorb the information fully before doing anything with it. "And you believe he didn't?" "I don't know what I believe," Serena said. "I know that number isn't in my phone. I know that number has my private line, which has been private for 3 years, and the only people who have it are you, Whitmore, as of this morning, and the 2 attorneys on the authorization team." She looked back at the phone. "And whoever sent this?" "Someone who knew your brother. Someone who either knew him or knows enough about him to use his name as a signal." She set the phone on the table. "Both of those options are a problem." She sat down. She needed to sit down, which was itself information, her body deciding that standing was more than it wanted to manage right now, while her mind ran the implications. She pressed her palms flat against the table surface again, that grounding habit, and let herself think. 11 years ago, Daniel Holloway had been 26. He had been a federal financial crimes analyst, 2 years into his career at the FBI's New York field office, working a case that he had never described to her in specific terms, but that had made him careful in the ways people become careful when they are close to something dangerous. He had been watchful in the months before the accident. He had called her more than usual. He had said things that she had filed under stress and overwork, and the particular intensity of someone new to a job that demanded a great deal and offered very little protection in return. The accident had happened on a Tuesday. She had been in the middle of her second year of law school. The call from her mother had come at 7 in the morning, and she remembered the specific quality of that morning. The gray November light, the smell of coffee she had made and not yet drunk, the way the ordinary details of a morning become unbearably specific in the moments before they are permanently attached to the worst thing that ever happened to you. She had never questioned the accident. She had grieved, and then she had moved forward because moving forward was the thing her system was built to do. And she had married Lucien and entered a world where the past was not a place you were encouraged to spend time in. Now she was sitting in a 53rd Street conference room with her dead brother's name on her phone, 45 minutes before she was supposed to walk into a Romano Holdings boardroom, and she was thinking about the things Daniel had said in the weeks before he died, running them through a filter she hadn't possessed at 23. He had said, "Be careful who you trust with your name." She had thought he meant professionally. She had thought he was talking about law school, about the early reputation-building decisions that shaped a legal career. She had stored the advice in that category and moved on. She pulled the phone back toward her and typed a single word into the reply field. "Prove it." She sent it. She watched the screen. The response took 4 minutes, which was long enough that she almost stood up and did something else, and short enough that she stayed where she was, watching the screen with the fixed attention of someone who has decided that what comes next is going to determine something important. When it arrived, it was not a name or a word. It was an image, a photograph, low resolution, the quality of something captured on a phone rather than a camera, showing 2 people sitting at a restaurant table. The image was dated in the corner, 3 weeks ago. One of the people at the table was a man she didn't recognize, late 50s, heavy set, the kind of face that had been weathered by decisions rather than weather. The other person was Nico Romano. She enlarged the image with 2 fingers and looked at the man across from Nico. He was turned slightly away from the camera, but enough of his face was visible that she could work with it. She stared at it. Something moved at the back of her memory. Not a specific recognition, but the ghost of one. The sense of a face that belonged to a context she couldn't immediately retrieve. She turned the phone to Vivian again. "Do you know him? The man with Nico?" Vivian studied the image. Her expression changed in a way that was subtle and significant. She set the phone down carefully. "That is Arthur Crane," she said. The name arrived and sat. Arthur Crane was the Deputy Director of Financial Crimes Enforcement at the FBI's New York field office. He had been in that position for 9 years. Before that, he had spent 6 years as a senior analyst in the same division, during the period when Daniel Holloway had been a junior analyst working financial crimes cases in the same office. The room was very quiet. "Nico Romano," Serena said slowly, has been meeting with a senior FBI financial crimes official. She heard her own voice from a slight distance, the detachment of someone processing a fact that is too large to process all at once. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks before Sunday. 3 weeks before you walked out of that estate, Vivian said. They looked at each other. Serena stood up. The flatness she had been carrying since Sunday was gone. In its place was something sharp and cold and moving fast. The specific cognitive state she entered when a legal problem revealed itself to be something more complex and more dangerous than its initial presentation. When the surface facts turned over and showed the machinery underneath. Nico wasn't trying to manage the crisis, she said. There is no crisis. Not for him. Vivian was already ahead of her. The Sunday lunch wasn't the trigger. It was the cover. He needed me out of the house, out of my position. He needed the authorization freeze to happen. He needed the legitimate empire to go into crisis, because a company in financial and legal crisis has a reason to cooperate with a federal investigation. It has a reason to open its books. And if the books are opened by outside auditors under duress, Nico controls what the auditors find, Vivian said, because he's been managing the document flow for 4 years. He can show them exactly what he wants them to see, Serena said, and what he wants them to see is Lucien. The empire, built on Lucien's decisions, structured around Lucien's authority. With Serena gone, with her authorizations frozen, with the company in crisis, Lucien takes the fall. And Nico walks out the other side with a cooperation agreement and whatever he negotiated with Arthur Crane 3 weeks ago. She picked up the phone. She looked at the image again. Nico Romano and Arthur Crane at a restaurant table 3 weeks ago, and somewhere in the distance between that table and this conference room, her brother's name appearing on her private line from a number she didn't know. She typed, "How long have you been alive?" The response came in under a minute this time. Not words. Another image. This one was a document. Federal issue. She could see that from the header format before she could read the specific text. She enlarged it and read it, and the sensation that moved through her body was not something she had a precise word for. Something between the bottom dropping out of a room and the sudden clarity that arrives when you finally read a document you've been handed and understand what it actually says. It was a federal witness protection enrollment document, dated 11 years and 1 month ago. The protected individual's name had been redacted from the image, but the case number was visible, and the supervising agent listed on the document was one Arthur Crane, then a senior analyst in the New York FBI Financial Crimes Division. Daniel Holloway had not died on the New Jersey Turnpike 11 years ago. He had been enrolled in witness protection by the same man who was now meeting privately with Nico Romano. She sat back down. She sat down because she had to. Her legs had made a decision independent of her intent, and she honored it, lowering herself into the chair with the controlled deliberateness of someone managing a physical response to information that had just restructured everything she thought she knew about the last 11 years of her life. "Vivian," she said. Her voice was different. She could hear that it was different. "I need you to tell me if there is any circumstance under which an FBI witness protection handler would maintain contact with the person who created the threat requiring the witness's protection." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. "If the handler was dirty," she said, "and the threat hadn't been neutralized, and the handler needed the witness's cooperation in a new operation that required the witness to surface." "Surface," Serena said, as in, make contact with someone connected to the original case. Serena looked at the phone, as in, send a text from a number that can't be traced to someone who is walking directly into the operation. The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had sat inside since Sunday. She understood it now. Not all of it. There were pieces she couldn't see yet, connections she would need time and documentation to trace, but the shape of it was visible, and the shape was this. Arthur Crane had enrolled her brother in witness protection 11 years ago, either because Daniel had been a legitimate witness to something that required that protection, or because someone had used the witness protection mechanism as a tool to remove a person who was inconvenient. Crane had then spent 11 years in his position, rising to deputy director, and 3 weeks ago he had sat down with Nico Romano and made an arrangement. And now Nico was in the Romano Holdings legal department trying to control a document archive, and Serena was being warned away from the Romano Holdings boardroom tonight by someone who either was her brother or had access to information only her brother would have. She typed, "Are you working with Crane?" The response, "I was. I'm not anymore. That's why I'm talking to you." She stared at the screen. She typed, "What happens tonight if I go to that boardroom?" The response took longer this time. She watched the typing indicator pulse on the screen, appearing, disappearing, appearing again, the rhythm of someone choosing words with care. When the message came through, it was longer than the others. Nico has a federal seizure warrant ready to execute on Romano Holdings' legitimate assets. It triggers the moment you enter that building as an authorized party, because your presence reactivates your legal standing and gives federal agents the hook they need to argue the freeze should convert to a seizure. Crane convinced a judge the restructuring terms are a fraudulent transfer attempt. If you walk in tonight, you hand them the evidence they need to take everything. Lucien goes down. The 4,000 employees go down with him. And Nico gets his deal. She read it 3 times. She had been walking toward tonight believing she was carrying the solution. The terms, the governance structure, the independent audit framework that would protect the legitimate empire and the people inside it. She had believed she was walking into a boardroom to save something. She had been walking into a seizure warrant. The phone buzzed again before she could respond. One more message from the unknown number. Vivian Ashcroft needs to see the case file on Romano Holdings that Crane has been building. It's not what she thinks it is. Check who filed the original federal interest notification on the company. Check the date. Then call me on this number. She handed the phone to Vivian without a word. Vivian read the messages. She read them twice. Then she set the phone on the table and did something Serena had never seen her do in 4 years of working together, which was press both hands flat against the table surface and close her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her expression had changed. It was still controlled. It was still Vivian. 62 years of professional composure did not evaporate because a situation turned out to be more complex than advertised. But underneath the control was something that Serena recognized because she had been living inside it for the last 48 hours, which was the look of someone recalculating the dimensions of the room they were standing in and discovering the room was significantly larger than they had believed. The original federal interest notification on Romano Holdings, Vivian said slowly. Check it, Serena said. Vivian picked up her desk phone and called one of her associates. She gave a case number that she appeared to know from memory, a number that, Serena noticed, she had not needed to look up. She asked for the original filing date and the filing party on the federal interest notification for Romano Holdings corporate group. She listened. Her expression did not change, but her hand tightened on the receiver in a way that was barely visible and entirely visible to someone watching for it. She said thank you and hung up. She looked at Serena. The federal interest notification was filed 7 years ago, Vivian said. The filing party was Ashcroft and Associates. The room contracted again. Serena heard the words. She processed them with the same methodical attention she processed everything, running them through the framework of what she knew, what she had believed, what she was now understanding. She looked at Vivian's face, the controlled expression, the tightened hand, the eyes that were holding hers with a directness that was almost aggressive, as if directness itself were a form of defense. Vivian, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Why did your firm file a federal interest notification on Romano Holdings 7 years ago? Because I was asked to, Vivian said. By a client. Under attorney-client privilege that I am not able to waive without who was the client. A pause that lasted long enough to have weight. Arthur Crane, Vivian said. The name hit the room and stayed there. Serena looked at the woman she had trusted with the architecture of her exit, the terms of her protection, the legal strategy that was supposed to keep her standing and the empire functional and the 4,000 employees safe. She looked at the woman she had called from the highway on Sunday evening, the first call she had made after leaving the estate, the person she had believed was entirely on her side. How long? Serena said. 7 years. Vivian did not look away. That was something. Crane needed a legitimate legal presence connected to Romano Holdings that could document the company's structure from the inside without triggering the family's security protocols. He approached me because he knew I had the standing and the reputation to be brought in as outside counsel without raising flags. I filed the notification to preserve federal interest in the company's legal architecture. She paused. I did not know it would be used the way it is being used now. You filed federal interest paperwork on a company, Serena said, and didn't know how the FBI intended to use it. I knew it was an ongoing investigation. I did not know Crane had made a private arrangement with Nico Romano. I did not know the investigation had been redirected. Vivian's voice remained level, but it had the quality of a level surface under a great deal of pressure, holding but audibly. When you came to me 3 weeks ago, I believed I was helping you execute a clean exit from a marriage and protecting your legal standing. I did not know that the exit I was helping you execute would be used as the triggering mechanism for a federal seizure action. Serena stood up. She picked up the second phone. She picked up the leather notebook. She picked up her jacket, which was over the back of the chair, and she put it on, lapels smoothed with the same deliberate care as this morning, because the alternative was to let her hands shake, and she was not going to let her hands shake. Serena, Vivian stood. I need you to understand that I am not Crane's instrument in this. Whatever I filed 7 years ago, I am telling you everything right now, which is not the behavior of someone who is working against you. I know, Serena said. And she did know, or she believed she did, which was the best she was going to manage right now. But you also just told me to a federal agent who has been coordinating with Nico Romano, which means Crane knows the terms, he knows the governance structure. He knows every move I was planning to make tonight. Vivian was quiet. Which means I can't make any of those moves, Serena said. Not one. Because every move I had is compromised. She stood in the center of Vivian Ashcroft's conference room, the room where she had believed she was safe, where she had laid out her strategy across nights of careful work, where she had trusted the architecture she was building. And she understood with absolute clarity that the architecture was gone. Everything she had built for the last 3 weeks had been built inside a space that Crane could see. The terms, the governance structure, the authorization freeze, the approach to Whitmore, the planned boardroom meeting tonight. All of it had been visible to a man who had been coordinating with Nico Romano, which meant all of it had been allowed to proceed because it was useful to someone else's plan, and the moment it became inconvenient, it would be used against her. She was not the architect anymore. She had been a piece on a board she hadn't known she was sitting on. The phone in her hand buzzed one more time. The unknown number. One message. Don't trust the terms. Don't trust the boardroom. Don't trust anyone who knew your plan before tonight. Meet me. I'll send the address. Come alone. Come now. Because in about 20 minutes, Crane is going to realize I sent you those images, and everything that's been building for 7 years is going to move at once. And when it does, the only person who can stop Nico from walking out of this clean is the person Crane spent 11 years keeping in the dark about what her brother actually found before they made him disappear. Serena read it once. She put the phone in her jacket pocket. She looked at Vivian Ashcroft, the woman who had filed federal paperwork on her behalf and against her simultaneously, who had spent 3 weeks building a legal strategy inside a compromised space, who was standing at the far end of this conference room with the specific expression of someone who had just run out of ground beneath a position they had believed was solid. I'm leaving, Serena said. Serena, I'm not running. Her voice was steady. I'm changing the board, because the board I've been playing on isn't the real one. She walked out of the conference room past Patricia at the front desk, who looked up with a question she didn't ask, through the lobby with its old ice marble and its design to intimidate seriousness, and out through the front doors of Vivian Ashcroft and Associates onto 53rd Street. The October air hit her again, sharp and cold, the same as this morning, the city moving around her with its vast indifference. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the phone and waited for the address. It came in 30 seconds. A location in Brooklyn. A neighborhood she knew, industrial, quiet at this hour, the kind of place that was full of people during the day and empty enough at night that a conversation could happen without witnesses. She had spent 11 years inside a life built on other people's architectures, Lucien's empire, Nico's manipulation, Crane's federal operation, even Vivian's compromised legal strategy. She had been the person who made other people's structures stand up, who built the load-bearing walls that nobody acknowledged until they were removed. She was done being inside someone else's architecture. Whatever was waiting for her in Brooklyn, whether it was her brother or someone using her brother's name, whether it was a way out or another layer of a trap she couldn't yet see, she was going toward it because it was the only direction left that she had chosen herself, and she was going to walk into it with nothing but what she actually knew, stripped of every plan that had been visible to the wrong people, operating without the terms and without the governance structure and without the safety of Vivian's office and the legal frameworks that had turned out to be someone else's tool. She walked to the curb and raised her hand for a cab. She was not the person who had driven off the Long Island estate on Sunday evening, certain she understood the shape of what she was dealing with. That person had believed the danger was behind her. That person had believed the architecture she was building was her own. The cab pulled up. She got in and gave the Brooklyn address in a voice that did not shake, and as the cab pulled into traffic and the Manhattan buildings moved past the windows, she understood that she was not walking toward a resolution, or a plan, or a set of terms that would make everything negotiable again. She was walking toward the truth about what had happened to her brother 11 years ago, and what it had cost, and what it meant that the man who had made him disappear was the same man who had been, for 7 years, building a case inside the legal architecture Serena had constructed with her own hands. And she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has finally read the document correctly, that the moment she walked into whatever was waiting in Brooklyn, she could no longer be the careful, methodical, structure-building woman who smoothed her lapels before entering a room. She was going to have to become something the architecture had never made room for. She was going to have to become dangerous. The cab crossed the bridge at 6:41, and Brooklyn opened up beneath the last of the October light, flat and industrial and honest in the way that parts of the city that don't perform for tourists are honest, the kind of landscape that doesn't bother prettying itself up because it has actual work to do. Serena watched it through the window with the fixed attention of someone cataloging an environment they may need to move through quickly and without the luxury of a second look. The address was a converted warehouse on a block that had been commercial manufacturing 30 years ago and was now the specific in-between of a neighborhood that hadn't decided yet what it was going to become. Loading docks that hadn't been used in a decade. A printing company that still operated, dark at this hour. A building on the corner whose ground floor had been converted to studio space and whose upper floors showed lights in 2 of the 6 windows. The address the number had sent her was the middle building on the block, 3 stories, brick that had gone from red to the color of dried blood over what looked like 60 or 70 years of weather, a roll-up door on the ground level that was closed, and a standard door beside it that was not. The cab stopped. She paid in cash. She had taken cash from the hotel safe this morning, another decision made 3 weeks ago that was now paying a return she hadn't specifically anticipated, and got out onto the sidewalk. The street was quiet, a truck 2 blocks north. Wind off the water carrying the smell of salt and diesel and something chemical from whatever industrial process was still running somewhere in this neighborhood. She stood on the sidewalk for 10 seconds, breathing it, reading the block the way she would read a document, looking for what was out of place, for the detail that didn't belong to the context. Nothing obvious, which was either good or the kind of bad that was specifically designed to look like nothing obvious. She walked to the unlocked door and pushed it open. The ground floor was a large open space that had been used for storage recently enough that the floor still had the shadow marks of pallets and shelving units. A few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling threw light in uneven pools. At the far end of the space, a metal staircase ran up to the 2nd floor, and at the base of the staircase, in a folding chair that seemed genuinely absurd in the context of everything else happening, sat a man she hadn't seen in 11 years. He was 42 years older than the last time she had seen his face, or rather, he was 37 and looked 42, which was what 11 years of living under a different name in a different life did to a person. He was thinner than she remembered, and the thinness was the permanent kind, the kind built into a body by sustained stress rather than circumstance. His hair was shorter, his face had lines that hadn't existed at 26, but the way he held himself, slightly forward, weight on the balls of his feet even when seated, the posture of someone who had never fully relaxed in any chair he'd ever sat in, that was exactly the same. Daniel Holloway looked at his sister across a warehouse floor in Brooklyn and said nothing for a moment. She said nothing either. Then she said, "You have about 90 seconds to give me a reason not to walk back out that door, and call every federal contact Vivian has left who isn't Arthur Crane. He stood up from the chair. He moved like someone whose body had a list of old injuries it consulted before committing to any motion. Vivian Ashcroft has 2 federal contacts left who aren't Crane, he said, and Crane already knows who they are. How long have you been watching her? Long enough? He gestured toward the staircase. Up. I've got everything up there, documents, recordings, the case file Crane has been building, all of it. She didn't move toward the staircase. You're going to stand there and tell me that you've been alive for 11 years, and you're only reaching out now because Crane made a move. Something crossed his face. Not guilt. He had moved past the place where guilt arrived cleanly. Something older than guilt, more worn down, the specific expression of someone who has rehearsed a conversation many times and is discovering that the rehearsal was not adequate. I reached out because the move he's making isn't just against the Romano family, Daniel said. It's against you specifically, and I can stop it, but only if you help me. You want my help, she said. I need your help. His voice was flat. And yes, I know how that sounds. She looked at him for another moment. Then she walked toward the staircase. The second floor had been set up with the functional austerity of someone operating without resources and with the need to be able to leave quickly. A folding table, a laptop, an external hard drive, several stacks of printed documents organized with the rubber-banded efficiency of someone who had been compiling them over time and didn't have file cabinets. 2 phones, both burners. A sleeping bag rolled up against the far wall. Whatever Daniel Holloway had been doing for 11 years, a portion of it had been done in rooms like this one. She stood at the table and looked at the documents without touching them. Her hands were in her jacket pockets. She could feel her own pulse in the tips of her fingers, elevated but even, the body's honest response to a situation it recognized as requiring maximum function. Talk, she said. He talked. He had been 26 when Arthur Crane recruited him, not enrolled him in witness protection, recruited him. That was the first correction he offered, and it landed with the particular weight of a load-bearing fact. Daniel had been a junior analyst in the Financial Crimes Division, 2 years in, and Crane had approached him about a long-term operation targeting organized crime family assets, specifically the strategy of building federal interest inside the legitimate corporate structures connected to major crime families by placing federal informants in positions adjacent to those structures. Adjacent to. Not inside. The distinction, Daniel said, was the thing he had believed at 26 and stopped believing at 27. Crane's operation had been running for 3 years before Daniel joined it. The strategy was straightforward in design and catastrophic in implication. Establish federal interest in a crime family's legitimate holdings, not by penetrating the criminal operation directly, which was expensive and dangerous and often inadmissible, but by cultivating relationships with the legal and financial professionals surrounding the legitimate corporate structure, who were not criminals and who could be persuaded, incentivized, or pressured into providing the kind of documented access that criminal penetration couldn't generate cleanly. Vivian Ashcroft had been one of those professionals. So had Richard Calloway at Calloway and Bright, whose emergency consultation request had landed on Vivian's desk that morning. So had 2 other attorneys and 1 investment banker whose names Daniel read to her from a list on the table and whom Serena recognized from years of Romano Holdings' work. Crane had spent 7 years building a federal interest case inside the legal architecture of Romano Holdings, using the professionals Serena trusted and worked alongside as his documentation network. Every major authorization Serena had executed, every restructuring agreement, every legal firewall. All of it had been observed, documented, and filed in a federal case file that was not a prosecution of the Romano crime family's illegal operations, but a civil asset seizure case targeting the legitimate corporate holdings, the hotels, the real estate, the investment portfolios, the restaurant groups, the things that employed 4,200 people and that Serena had spent 11 years building legal protections around. Crane's theory of the case, the legal argument he had been building for 7 years, was that the legitimate holdings were not actually legitimate, that they were structured to launder proceeds from criminal activity through the mechanism of Serena's legal authorizations, and that Serena herself, knowingly or unknowingly, had been the instrument through which criminal proceeds had been converted to protected legitimate assets. The case named Serena as the primary enabling mechanism. Not as a target. Crane had been careful about that, Daniel said, because naming her as a target would require proving criminal intent, which he couldn't do, but as the mechanism, the authorizations, the legal standing, the guarantees, her work, her name. 7 years of her work reframed as the enabling architecture of a money laundering operation. She had been standing at the table listening to this. She was still standing. Her legs had not done what they had done in Vivian's conference room. She was holding herself at a level of stillness that required active maintenance, the same stillness she brought to a deposition when a witness said something that she needed to absorb without showing that she was absorbing it. "Nico," she said, "where does Nico fit?" Daniel sat down in the single chair at the folding table. Crane needed someone inside the Romano family structure who could help him direct the case toward Lucian and away from the legitimate operation. He needed someone who could draw the line between the criminal and the corporate in a way that made the criminal look like Lucian's personal enterprise, and the corporate look like a separate structure that had been contaminated by Lucian's decisions rather than built to serve them. He looked up at her. "Nico has been cooperating with Crane for 3 years. He gets a full immunity agreement and a negotiated share of any asset recovery. Lucien goes to federal prison. The legitimate holdings get seized, restructured under federal oversight, and resold. And Nico gets a percentage of the sale price as his cooperation reward. And the 4,000 employees get absorbed into whatever corporate structure buys the seized assets, or they don't." He said it without flinching, which told her he had spent time in the part of himself that found that acceptable and had come out the other side unable to be comfortable with it. Crane doesn't care about the employees. She moved her hands out of her pockets. She put them on the table, flat, and leaned forward. "And my brother," she said. "Where does my brother fit?" Daniel looked at her. The warehouse sounds, the building settling, wind against the upper floor windows, a truck somewhere on the block, filled the space between them. "I found the line," he said, "between Crane's operation and Nico's cooperation. I found the point at which the federal investigation stopped being a legitimate law enforcement action and became a private arrangement between a federal agent and a target's family member for personal financial gain. That's not law enforcement. That's extortion." He paused. "I documented it. And when Crane found out I'd documented it, he gave me a choice, disappear or be disappeared. And you disappeared. I had 48 hours. I used them." She looked at him for a long moment, at the lines in his face and the rolled sleeping bag against the wall and the stacks of rubber-banded documents on the folding table, at the 11 years of living in a shape that wasn't his own, doing whatever he had been doing in whatever sequence of rooms like this one had constituted his life since a Tuesday in November when their mother had called her at 7 in the morning. She picked up the first stack of documents and read the top page. It was a memorandum from Arthur Crane to a federal judge dated 6 years ago, requesting the renewal of a sealed federal interest designation on Romano Holdings Corporate Group. The memo cited ongoing criminal enterprise concerns and referenced specific legal instruments as evidence of the entanglement between the criminal operation and the legitimate holdings. The specific legal instruments cited were ones Serena had executed. Her name appeared 4 times on the first page alone, each time as the authorizing party on a document being used as evidence of criminal entanglement. She set it down. She picked up the second stack. This one was different. It was a series of internal communications, not federal documents, but emails printed from what appeared to be a private account, the header formatting consistent with a personal email service rather than a government system. The emails were between Crane and Nico Romano, spanning the last 3 years, and they were extraordinarily specific about the timeline and the mechanism of the cooperation arrangement. They discussed Sunday. They discussed Bianca Vale by name. They discussed the expected outcome of Serena's departure from the estate and the legal authorization freeze that would follow, and the way in which that freeze could be represented to a federal judge as evidence of an attempt to obstruct the federal interest designation. She had walked out of that estate on Sunday and triggered an authorization freeze and believed she was executing a plan she had designed. She had been executing a plan Nico and Crane had designed, The freeze was the evidence they needed. Her departure was the observable event that justified the seizure warrant, and tonight's boardroom meeting, the meeting she had almost walked into, was the moment her reactivated legal standing would have given Crane's team the final hook to execute. 3 weeks of work. Her work, Vivian's work, and all of it pointing toward a room that was a federal trap. "The recordings," she said. Her voice was still level. She did not know how her voice was still level. "You said recordings." Daniel reached under the table and produced a small external drive. 3 years of phone recordings. Crane's personal line. He ran his Nico communications off his government phone for the first year and then switched to personal when he got concerned about internal oversight. "He didn't know I had a tap on the personal line." A pause. "He still doesn't know." She picked up the drive. She turned it in her hand. This was the thing. This small rectangle of plastic and metal was the difference between Crane's 7-year operation succeeding and collapsing. Between Lucien going to federal prison for a case built on manufactured evidence and a corrupt arrangement, and Crane himself being exposed for what he had done. Between 4,200 people losing their jobs and livelihoods, and the legitimate empire being protected by the thing it had always been protected by. The integrity of its legal structure. Her legal structure. Her authorizations. Her name, which had been used for 7 years as evidence of criminal entanglement, and which she was now going to use as the instrument that dismantled the case built around it. "I need a phone," she said. Daniel looked at her. "Who are you calling?" "Not Vivian, not Calloway." She met his eyes. "I need the number of the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, and I need it in the next 4 minutes, because Crane is going to realize you've surfaced, and when he does..." The door at the base of the staircase opened. Both of them went still. Footsteps on the metal stairs. Not one person, 2, moving with the specific cadence of people who were not trying to be quiet because they had decided quiet was no longer the relevant variable. Serena looked at Daniel. He was already on his feet, one hand going to the table, and she registered with the part of her brain that had spent 11 years in rooms with dangerous people that he was reaching for something under the table's edge and finding nothing there. The staircase door opened. Nico Romano came through first. He was in a suit that had been immaculate this morning and showed the marks of a day spent moving fast. Jacket open, the collar of his shirt pulling, his dark hair disrupted in a way that communicated hours of running a hand through it. Behind him came a man she didn't know, large and unhurried, whose specific quality of unhurried movement communicated professional rather than personal motivation. Nico looked at Serena. He looked at Daniel. He took a breath that was almost but not quite a laugh, the breath of a man finding a situation more complicated than he expected, but not complicated enough to change his fundamental assessment of his own position. "Serena," he said. His voice had the careful warmth of a man who had decided that warmth was still the correct performance. "You should have gone to the boardroom." "You needed me to go to the boardroom," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "We need to talk about what you think you know. We need to talk about 3 years of emails between you and Arthur Crane on a private account," she said, "and about a cooperation agreement that gives you a percentage of asset recovery on a seizure case built on fabricated criminal entanglement evidence, and about a federal agent who enrolled my brother in witness protection not because his life was in danger from the Romano family, but because he had documentation of Crane's own corrupt conduct." She watched his face. "Do you want to keep doing the warmth, or can we be honest about what's happening in this room?" The warmth went. It went cleanly, the way a performance ends when the performer decides the audience is gone. What was underneath it was something she had not seen on Nico Romano's face in 4 years of working alongside him. Not anger, not fear exactly, but the specific focused quality of a man who has moved past the point where there are comfortable options and is now purely in the business of assessing what remains. He looked at the drive in her hand. "Give me the drive, Serena." "No. You don't understand what's already in motion." His voice had changed, still controlled, but the control was structural now, holding something back rather than producing something forward. "The seizure warrant has been filed. It executes at 9 p.m. tonight whether you go to that boardroom or not. I moved the trigger when you didn't show." She felt it, the physical impact of the information arriving in her chest. the specific sensation of a wall she had believed was holding, turning out to be already gone. She kept her face still. "You filed early," Daniel said from beside her. "I moved the timeline when you surfaced." Nico's eyes moved to Daniel with something that might have been, in a different context, a form of respect. "I didn't expect you to find her in time. That was a miscalculation." He looked back at Serena. "But it doesn't change the warrant. It executed the moment I made the call from the car." She looked at her watch. 6:58, 62 minutes. "The warrant covers all Romano Holdings' legitimate assets," Nico said. "Every corporate entity, every account, every property, it all freezes at 9 p.m. and enters federal receivership." He took a step toward her. The large man behind him moved forward by the same increment. "Unless someone with active legal authorization status files a formal challenge to the federal interest designation before 9, which requires an authorized party, which requires you." She understood what he was doing. He had moved the timeline not to beat her, but to force her. He still needed her, even now, even with everything out in the open, because the legal challenge to the federal interest designation, the thing that could stop the seizure, required an authorized party's signature and filing, and she was the only person in the world who could do it. He needed her to save the empire. The same way Lucien had needed her, the same way they had all needed her, the whole structure of them, for 11 years. "If I file the challenge," she said slowly, "I reactivate my authorization status, and Crane uses my reactivation as the evidence of obstruction he's been waiting for. If you don't file, 4,000 people lose their jobs at 9 p.m. tonight, and Lucien goes to prison for a case I built brick by brick." Nico's voice was completely flat now. "So you choose." The warehouse was silent except for the building and the wind and her own breathing, which she could hear with unusual clarity. In and out, steady, the body doing the thing it did regardless of what the mind was trying to process. She looked at the drive in her hand. She looked at Daniel, who was watching her with the expression of someone who has run out of moves and is waiting to see what the person beside him has left. She looked at Nico Romano, who had spent 3 years building a mechanism designed to use her as a component and was now standing in a Brooklyn warehouse telling her that the component was still necessary, that all of his engineering still required her cooperation at the final step, that for all the sophistication of what he had constructed, it came down to this. He needed Serena Holloway to put her name on something. Her name. The thing he had spent 4 years erasing. The thing Crane had spent 7 years reframing as criminal entanglement. The thing every man in this situation had simultaneously needed and attempted to minimize. Her name, her standing, her signature on the bottom of a document. Something clicked into place with a precision that felt almost architectural. "You said the challenge has to be filed before 9, she said. "Yes." "By an authorized party?" "Yes." "And the challenge document has to reference the original federal interest notification." She kept her voice even, methodical, the conference room voice. "It has to engage directly with the legal basis of the federal interest claim." "That's standard," Nico started. "The original federal interest notification," she said, "was filed by Ashcroft and Associates 7 years ago, on behalf of a client." She watched his face. "If the filing party on the original notification was acting under a compromised instruction, if the attorney who filed it can demonstrate that she was instrumentalized by a federal agent operating outside his lawful authority, then the notification itself is procedurally defective, which means the federal interest designation it established is built on a defective foundation, which means the seizure warrant derived from that designation, not valid," Daniel said. He said it quietly, with the voice of someone who has just watched a legal argument construct itself in real time and recognized what it means. Nico went very still. "The warrant is defective at its foundation," Serena said, "not because of anything I did, not because of any action I take tonight, because the document that started this 7 years ago was filed by an attorney acting on the instruction of a federal agent who was using the filing to establish the basis for a corrupt private arrangement with the target's family member. That's not federal interest. That's fraud on the court." She looked at Nico with a steadiness she felt in her bones. "And I don't need to file a challenge to stop the seizure. I need Vivian Ashcroft to file a withdrawal of the original notification citing the circumstances of its filing, tonight, before 9. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Nico moved fast. He crossed the distance between them in 4 strides, and his hand was on her arm. Not violent, but definitive, the grip of someone removing a variable from the equation. And the large man behind him was moving too, and she heard Daniel make a sound, and then the sound of Daniel moving, and then the sound of Daniel and the large man making contact somewhere behind her. And she did not look back because she was looking at Nico, and Nico was looking at her, and she could feel his hand on her arm and the drive in her other hand, and she was thinking about one thing. "The drive," Nico said. His voice was very close. "Give me the drive, and I will make sure the seizure warrant is withdrawn. I will tell Crane you never surfaced. I will tell him Daniel never reached you. You walk away clean." His grip tightened. "This is the last version of this offer that exists." She looked at him. Behind her she could hear Daniel, still moving, still on his feet, the sound of a struggle that was not going well but had not yet gone badly enough. She looked at Nico Romano's face, the face of a man who had spent 3 years building something that still, at its final moment, required the cooperation of the woman he had spent 4 years trying to make invisible. She held the drive. She thought about 4,200 people. She thought about her name on the bottom of documents for 11 years, the name everyone needed and no one acknowledged, the load-bearing wall no one could see until it was gone. She thought about a folding chair in a Brooklyn warehouse and a sleeping bag against a wall and 11 years of a life lived under the wrong name. She looked at Nico Romano and said, "I need my phone." He didn't understand for a half second. She could see him not understanding. The slight delay, the recalibration. "What?" "My phone, the second one. Let go of my arm and let me make one call." She held his gaze. "One call, Nico, right now, and you'll get what you want from this." He studied her. The calculation in his eyes was visible and rapid, and then it settled into something that was almost confidence, almost the confidence of a man who believes he understands what the person across from him is about to do. He let go of her arm. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the second phone and dialed Vivian Ashcroft's direct line. It rang once. "Serena, Vivian, listen to me. I have 48 minutes. I need you to pull the original federal interest notification you filed 7 years ago on Romano Holdings. I need you to draft a withdrawal citing fraud on the court. Specifically, that the notification was filed under the instruction of a federal agent acting outside his lawful authority in furtherance of a private corruption arrangement. I need it filed with the court of record before 9 p.m. tonight." She paused one beat. "Can you do that?" Vivian was silent for 2 seconds. "Yes," she said. "Then do it." Serena looked at Nico Romano, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "And Vivian, file it under your own name. Take responsibility for the original filing and the withdrawal both. It's the only way it works." Another silence. Longer. She could hear Vivian breathing. She could hear the weight of what she was asking, which was not small. She was asking a 62-year-old woman with a 35-year reputation to walk into a court filing and confess that she had been an instrument of federal corruption, even unwittingly, even under the pressure of an agent who had deceived her about the purpose of the notification. "Vivian," she said, "you told me this afternoon that you are not Crane's instrument. This is how you prove it." The silence lasted 5 seconds. "I'll have it filed by 8:45, Vivian said, and hung up. Serena put the phone back in her pocket. She looked at Nico. She looked at the drive in her hand. Behind her, the sounds of struggle had stopped, and she could hear Daniel breathing, ragged, uneven, the breathing of someone who had taken damage but was still standing. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on Nico. "The withdrawal kills the warrant," she said. "The warrant dies before 9. No seizure, no federal receivership. 4,200 people show up to work tomorrow." She held up the drive. "And this, everything on this, goes to the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility tonight. Not to protect Lucien, not to save the Romano criminal operation, to expose what Crane did, what you did." She paused. Crane faces prosecution. You face prosecution, and whatever deal you made with him dies with the case he built. Nico's jaw was tight. The calculation in his eyes had shifted into something harder. You know what happens to me, he said. Yes, she said, I do. Lucien will decide what he does with his brother, she said. That's between them. I'm done making decisions about what the Romano family does with itself. The large man behind Nico was very still. Nico himself was very still. The warehouse held all of them in its particular silence, and the October wind pushed against the upper floor windows, and Serena stood in the center of it holding a small plastic drive that contained 3 years of recordings and a legal career built on a name that everyone had needed and no one had valued. And she was not shaking, and she was not collapsing, and she was not waiting for anyone to tell her what the next move was. She was the one who knew what the next move was. She was the one who had always known. I'm walking out of here, she said. Both of us are walking out of here. And you're going to let that happen because the only alternative is adding obstruction and assault to what's already going to be a very detailed filing with the Office of Professional Responsibility, and you are not stupid enough to make this worse than it already is. She looked at him steadily. Are you? Nico Romano looked at his sister-in-law across a warehouse floor in Brooklyn at 7:03 on a Monday evening in October, and the thing that crossed his face was not what she expected. Not rage, not the cold calculation of someone planning a next move, but something closer to the expression of a man who has just watched the architecture he spent years building get walked through without stopping by the person he built it specifically to contain. He stepped back. She walked. She walked to Daniel, who was standing against the wall with one hand pressed against his ribs and his face showing the specific gray of someone managing pain through willpower, and she took his arm without ceremony, and they walked to the staircase and down it, and across the warehouse floor, and out the unlocked door, and onto the Brooklyn street where the October night had arrived fully, cold and dark, and carrying the smell of the water. They stood on the sidewalk. Daniel said, "The OPR filing. Tonight," she said. "We do it tonight." She looked at the drive. "Do you have everything you need?" "Yes." "Then we need a cab and a working printer and 45 minutes. He looked at her, at his sister, standing on a Brooklyn sidewalk with a drive in her hand and a charcoal suit that had been put on that morning in a hotel room and was still, improbably, presentable. At the person who had just dismantled 3 years of federal corruption architecture in a warehouse using a phone call and a legal argument assembled in real time from components that had been lying around the room. "Serena," he said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard in 11 years. "Not yet," she said. Her own voice was not unkind. "There's time for that. After 9. She raised her hand for a cab. Above the Brooklyn rooftops, the Manhattan skyline burned against the dark sky like something that had decided, a long time ago, to keep its lights on regardless of what happened at street level. And Serena Holloway stood under it with everything she needed in the palm of her hand, 42 minutes left on the clock, and not a single move left that belonged to anyone but her. The cab they found was driven by a man who did not speak and did not ask questions, which was exactly what the moment required. Serena sat in the back with Daniel beside her, his breathing still carrying that ragged quality, his hand still pressed to his ribs, and she did not ask him how bad it was because there was no version of that answer that changed what they needed to do in the next 40 minutes. She opened the external drive's file index on the burner laptop Daniel had brought down from the warehouse table, running through the recordings directory while the cab moved north through Brooklyn toward the bridge. There were 47 audio files. She opened the most recent 3 and listened to 30 seconds of each through the single earbud Daniel handed her without being asked. Crane's voice was identifiable immediately. She had never met Arthur Crane, but she had heard recordings of his congressional testimony 4 years ago in connection with a financial crimes oversight hearing. And the voice on these files was the same voice, same cadence, same particular quality of bureaucratic confidence that comes from 20 years of operating inside a system that has consistently protected you. The calls were specific. They were dated. They referenced the Romano Holdings case file by number and Nico Romano by name and the terms of the cooperation arrangement in language that left no meaningful ambiguity about what had been agreed and what each party expected to receive. "These are enough," she said. "I know," Daniel said, OPR will open an investigation within 24 hours of receiving these. I know that too. She looked at him. At the sight of his face, the unfamiliar lines of it, the profile of someone she had known completely and then had to reconstruct from memory for 11 years until the memory had become more reliable than anything she would have been able to verify against reality. When this is over, she said, you're going to have to surface officially. Witness protection termination, whatever the process is. I know. Mom is alive, she said. She's in Connecticut. She stopped. There was no way to complete that sentence that wasn't enormous, and the cab was moving and there were 38 minutes left, and enormous things required more than 38 minutes. She's alive, she said again. That's what matters right now. Daniel looked out the window. His jaw moved once, a small involuntary contraction, the body doing something the face was trying not to do. He didn't speak. She did not push him. She went back to the laptop. She needed a printer. She needed a court filing platform with after-hours emergency access, which existed for exactly these situations, time-sensitive legal actions requiring same-day court record entry, and which she had used twice in her legal career, both times under circumstances that now felt quaint compared to what she was doing in the back of a Brooklyn cab at 7:19 on a Monday evening in October. She pulled up the platform on the burner laptop, entered her bar association credentials, and began building the OPR complaint document from the template Daniel had partially drafted on his laptop at the warehouse table. The cab crossed the bridge. Manhattan opened around them. At 7:41, Vivian Ashcroft called. It's filed, Vivian said. Her voice was different from any version of it Serena had heard across 4 years of working together, stripped of the professional architecture, the controlled pace, the 35-year reputation of someone who chose every word deliberately. She sounded, for the first time, like a 62-year-old woman who had just done something that cost her something real. Withdrawal of the original federal interest notification, citing fraud on the court. Filed under my name and the firm's name. The court clerk confirmed receipt at 7:39. Serena exhaled. One breath. Controlled. The specific release of a person who has been holding something at muscular effort and can now set it down. Thank you, Vivian. Don't. The word was short, not harsh. Don't thank me for doing what I should have verified I was doing 7 years ago. A pause. Is Daniel safe? Serena looked at her brother. He's with me. There's something else, Vivian said. Lucien Romano called this office 40 minutes ago. He's been trying to reach you. He said... Another pause, and in it, Serena could hear Vivian making a decision about something. He said he spoke to Whitmore. He said he wants to speak to you directly. Not through counsel, not tonight. He said he'll wait. Serena said nothing for a moment. He also said, Vivian continued, that he found the memo. The internal memo from 6 years ago, ordering Romano Holdings executives to remove documentation of your contributions from the company's official records. He said he signed it. A beat. He said he didn't remember signing it, which I believe is true and also irrelevant. It's both of those things, Serena said. What do you want me to tell him? Tell him I'll be in touch when I'm finished with what I'm doing right now. She paused. And Vivian, the OPR filing. I need to submit it in the next 20 minutes. I'm working from Daniel's documentation. I need you to co-sign as a material witness to Crane's use of your firm as an unwitting instrument. The silence on the other end lasted long enough to have texture. Send it to me, Vivian said finally. I'll sign it and we'll file it together. She hung up. Daniel had been listening. He looked at Serena with an expression she remembered from childhood, from the specific moments when their dynamic had clarified itself most purely, which were the moments of difficulty, the moments when the situation was bad enough that performance fell away, and what was left was just the two of them being whatever they actually were. He had always looked at her in those moments with something between assessment and recognition, as if he was confirming that the person he believed she was still the person she was being. Your attorney just walked herself into a bar complaint to help you file an OPR action against a federal deputy director, he said. She instrumentalized a federal interest notification against a company I spent 11 years building legal protections for. Serena said. This is the minimum. She didn't know. She filed without verifying, Serena said. At our level, that's the same thing. She looked back at the laptop screen. She knows that. That's why she's signing. They found a business center in a hotel on 49th Street that had a printer available to non-guests for a fee, and Serena paid the fee in cash and printed the OPR complaint document, 14 pages, 3 exhibits, an attached directory of the 47 audio files on the external drive. While Daniel stood at the counter beside her managing his ribs, with the specific stillness of someone who is determined that any position other than the one they are currently in would make things worse. She read through the printed pages once, fast, the way she read final documents. Not for content, which she knew, but for errors, for the gaps and the places where language might be doing something unintentional. She found 2. She corrected them on the laptop, reprinted both affected pages, assembled the document in order. Vivian's co-signature arrived electronically at 8:11. Serena incorporated it into the filing package. At 8:17, she submitted the OPR complaint through the federal complaint portal, attached the document package, and uploaded the audio file directory with a verification hash that would confirm the files had not been modified since their original capture date. The portal confirmation arrived at 8:19. She stood at the business center counter in a midtown hotel with a printed confirmation in her hand and Daniel beside her, and 41 minutes remaining before the seizure warrant's 9 p.m. execution window, and the seizure warrant was going to arrive at a defective federal interest designation that no longer existed because Vivian had withdrawn it 18 minutes ago, and Arthur Crane was going to arrive at his office tomorrow morning to find an OPR complaint filed against him with 47 audio recordings attached. And Nico Romano was going to spend the night determining whether the deal he had made with a compromised federal agent was worth the exposure it was now going to generate. She folded the confirmation and put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at Daniel. "Hungry?" she said. He blinked. It was such a spectacularly ordinary question in the context of the last 3 hours that it seemed to require a moment of recalibration. "Yeah," he said finally. "Actually, yes." They found a diner 2 blocks from the hotel, the kind that had been in the same location for 30 years and would be for another 30, the kind that served coffee in ceramic mugs that were slightly too heavy and food that arrived faster than seemed possible and tasted better than it had any architectural reason to. They sat in a booth near the back and ordered without looking at the menu, which was the prerogative of people who had spent enough time in New York diners to know that the menu was a formality. The coffee arrived. Serena wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the heat move through her palms and up into her wrists, and thought about the last time she had eaten, which had been the Romano family Sunday lunch, and how much had happened since a dining room table in Long Island. Daniel drank his coffee with the focused appreciation of someone for whom ordinary things had not been ordinary in a long time. He set the mug down and looked at the table for a moment. "I need to tell you something about the 11 years, he said. "You don't have to do it tonight." "I know, but I want to." He looked up. "I want you to know that the first 3 years, I thought I was protecting you. Specifically, you. Crane had told me that the Romano family would come for anyone I'd been close to if my disappearance looked suspicious rather than accidental. He said the accident made you safe. I believed him." He paused. "It took me 3 years to understand that the accident making me dead made you available. That you couldn't be Serena Holloway with a living federal analyst brother. You had to be Serena Romano, fully in, no exits." She looked at him. At the worn lines of his face and the way his hand was still slightly unsteady around the coffee mug and the expression of a man delivering a verdict he has been sitting with alone for a long time. "Crane wanted me inside Romano Holdings," she said. "He needed the legal architecture to get built. He needed someone with your standing, your family name, your legal ability inside the structure. A Romano wife who happened to have the professional capacity to become the company's legal architect." Daniel's voice was level. "I don't know if he planned the marriage. I think it was opportunistic. You were already seeing Lucien when I disappeared, and Crane recognized what that position could produce." He paused. "I think he let it happen. I think he made sure it could keep happening." She absorbed this. She absorbed it the way she absorbed large legal facts, completely, without immediate reaction, allowing the full shape of it to settle before deciding what it meant for anything that came next. Outside the diner window, 47th Street moved in its ordinary Monday night rhythm, people going home from work, a delivery bike threading between cars, a couple arguing at the corner with the specific energy of people who have been arguing the same argument for a long time and are committed to finishing it. "He used me for 7 years," she said, "without my knowledge." "Yes. And the work I did, the legal architecture, the authorizations, the restructuring, all of it was building his case as I was building the company." "Yes." She picked up her coffee. She drank. "Then the work was still real," she said. "The protections I built were real. The 4,200 people have jobs that exist because the work was real, regardless of what Crane was doing with the documentation of it." She set the mug down. "He can't take that." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "He can't." The food arrived. They ate. The diner moved around them in its particular rhythm, and nobody looked at them, and nobody knew what had happened in a Brooklyn warehouse, and a 53rd Street conference room, and a Midtown Hotel business center in the last 4 hours. And that anonymity was so ordinary and so complete that it felt briefly like a form of mercy. At 9:03, Serena's second phone buzzed. A text from Whitmore. "Seizure warrant execution failed. Federal agents arrived at Romano Holdings at 9 p.m. and were informed by the building's legal counsel that the underlying federal interest designation had been withdrawn. They are gone. The building is clear." She showed it to Daniel. He read it. He nodded once. He went back to his food. At 9:17, a call came from a number she had turned off on Sunday evening and had not turned back on until 30 minutes ago. She looked at the screen. She let it ring through once. Then she picked up. "Serena." Lucienne Romano's voice had a quality she did not recognize from 11 years of marriage, which was the quality of a voice that has had everything it used to perform stripped away from it by a single day of discovering what it had been standing on. Raw was not the right word. Honest was closer. "I've spoken to Whitmore. I've read the documents." A pause. "I've read what I signed 6 years ago, the memo." She waited. "I need you to know that I didn't understand what I was signing," he said. "That's not an excuse. I'm not saying it to get something back. I'm saying it because you deserve to know that when I signed a document ordering the removal of your name from the company's record, I didn't understand that your name was holding the record up." His voice was steady, but steadiness under weight sounds different from steadiness in ordinary conditions, and this was the former. "I didn't understand anything about what you'd built, because I never looked." She listened to him breathing on the other end of the line. "Nico," she said. "I know." The word was almost inaudible. "Whitmore told me. Vivian's filing told me. What Nico was doing—" He stopped. She heard him stop. "We're talking. Lucienne and Nico. We've been talking for the last hour. I don't know what happens with that. I don't know what it means yet for the family. I only know that I—" Another stop. "I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say." "Then don't say it tonight," she said. Her voice was not cold. It was something more complicated than cold. It was the voice of a person who has made it to the other side of something enormous and is no longer standing inside the urgency of it, who can afford to be patient in a way that would have been impossible yesterday. "There will be time for whatever needs to be said. Not tonight." A long pause. "Are you safe?" he asked. "Yes." Daniel, he knew. Whitmore had told him, or Vivian had, or the OPR filing had. It didn't matter which. He knew that Daniel Holloway was alive. She could hear in the single word the weight of what that knowledge contained for a man who had been married to a woman for 11 years and had not known, because no one had told him, that her brother was alive. "Is he with you?" "Yes." Another pause. "Okay," Lucienne said. Just that. Okay. The word of a man who has run out of the larger things and is now down to the only one that still makes sense, which is the acknowledgement that something is true and that he is going to have to sit with what it means. "Okay." She said goodbye and ended the call. The diner hummed around them. Daniel had finished eating and was sitting with his coffee, and he looked at her across the table with a question he didn't ask. and she answered it by putting her phone in her pocket and picking up her own coffee and not saying anything for a while. They paid the check and walked out into the October night. The city was in its 11 p.m. mode. Not quiet, New York was never quiet, but shifted into a different register. The daytime compression loosened into something more scattered, more honest. The city being whatever it actually was when it stopped performing for the version of itself it showed between 9 and 5. They walked south without a specific destination, the way you walk when the walking itself is the point, when what you need for movement is not arrival, but the simple continuation of it. Daniel walked with one hand still slightly guarding his ribs, and she walked beside him and thought about all the walks they had not taken in 11 years, and did not say that, because it was too large for a sidewalk and it would be too large for a long time. And the practice of being with large things that couldn't be contained was something she was going to have to build the same way she had built everything else that mattered in her life. Slowly, carefully, with attention to the foundation. 3 days later, the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility opened a formal investigation into Arthur Crane. The announcement was internal, not public, but it reached the right people within hours. Crane was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's preliminary findings. The Romano Holdings federal interest designation remained withdrawn. The case file Crane had spent 7 years building was flagged for review pending the OPR investigation's outcome. Nico Romano retained a criminal defense attorney on the morning after the warehouse. He did not speak to his brother for 6 days. When they spoke, when Lucien and Nico finally sat in a room together and had whatever conversation happened in that room, none of it was visible to anyone outside the family, which was how certain kinds of reckoning worked, contained inside the walls where the original damage had been done. What came out of that room eventually was this. Nico Romano removed himself from any operational role in Romano Holdings. He was not prosecuted in the end because his cooperation arrangement with Crane had been coerced under circumstances that a competent defense attorney could make look like entrapment, and the federal case that entrapment had been designed to serve was itself collapsing. He was not vindicated. He simply became a private person in a family that would never quite be the same shape it had been before, which was a different and perhaps more accurate form of consequence than a courtroom would have produced. Vivian Ashcroft filed a voluntary disclosure with the Bar Association regarding the Romano Holdings federal interest notification. The disclosure was comprehensive and unambiguous. She had filed a federal notification on the instruction of a federal agent without adequately verifying the legitimacy of the instruction's purpose, and she was disclosing this proactively and completely. The Bar's review took 4 months. At its conclusion, she received a formal censure and a 2-year probationary oversight period on any federally adjacent filings. She continued to practice. She did not reduce her billable hours or the scope of her client list. What she did do in the months that followed was refer 3 cases to Serena's new firm that she would previously have kept because some debts are not paid with money, and she understood that. Daniel Holloway formally terminated his witness protection status in November, 5 weeks after the Brooklyn warehouse. The process required depositions, documentation, and the specific bureaucratic patience of a man who had spent 11 years navigating systems designed to contain rather than release. His first call to their mother lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, and Serena did not ask him what was said because it belonged to him and to her mother and to the specific geography of a relationship that had been interrupted for 11 years and was now attempting, carefully, to find what remained of its original shape. He moved to Manhattan in December. He took a position with a financial compliance consulting firm, not federal, not law enforcement, not anything that required him to operate inside the machinery he had spent 11 years watching from the wrong angle. He was good at it. He had always been good at reading the distance between what a structure was designed to do and what it was actually doing, and it turned out that skill was valuable in contexts that did not require anyone to disappear. Romano Holdings underwent the governance restructuring that Serena had originally designed in Vivian's office, minus the pieces that had been compromised. Independent auditors assumed oversight of the legitimate corporate divisions. External compliance protocols replaced the informal family governance that had allowed 11 years of the organization's actual architecture to go unacknowledged. James Whitmore remained as COO with an expanded mandate and a compensation adjustment that reflected, for the first time, the actual scope of what his position required. 4,200 people continued going to work. Lucien Romano did not pursue any form of legal contest to the governance restructuring. He signed every document he was asked to sign through counsel without negotiation. He did not call Serena again after the night in the diner, not for 3 months. When he did call, when the 3 months had passed and the restructuring was fully implemented and the OPR investigation had moved into its formal phase and the shape of the aftermath had become something stable enough to stand on, it was a brief call, businesslike in format, and not entirely businesslike in content. He had fired his personal jeweler, he told her. For no particular reason, he wanted her to know that. She had not asked. He asked about Daniel. She told him Daniel was doing well, in Manhattan, working. There was a pause of the kind that contains something being decided and then set aside, something being looked at and then covered again, the specific pause of a man who understands that there are conversations he does not have the standing to initiate and is choosing to honor that limitation. He said he was glad Daniel was safe. She believed he meant it. He said, "The memo, the one from 6 years ago. I want you to know that I had it pulled from the archive and formally rescinded." Whitmore oversaw the process. "It's in the company record now as a rescinded document." A pause. "It doesn't change what it said. I know that. But I wanted there to be a record of the rescission." She thought about the memo, the internal directive ordering executives to remove documentation of her contributions from the company's official records. She thought about the 6 years it had sat in a filing system, doing its quiet work of erasure while she worked on the 3rd floor of the Long Island estate at 6 in the morning, building the structures the family used and never acknowledged. "That was the right call," she said. Silence. "Serena." His voice had the quality it had had on the phone 3 months ago. Stripped, direct, without the performance that 11 years of a particular kind of power had built around it like a second skin. "I know there's nothing that makes any of this right. I know that's not what you need from me, and it's not what I'm trying to offer. But I want to say it anyway because I think the only honest thing left for me to do is say what's actually true without expecting anything back from it." A pause. "You built something real. 11 years of something real. And I spent 11 years either not seeing it or looking away from what I saw. And that is the thing I'm going to have to carry." She listened to him carry it for a moment through the phone. "Power isn't measured by who fears you," she said. "You know that now. That's worth something." "Not enough." "No," she said. "Not enough. But it's what there is." Holloway Strategic Capital opened its doors in January, in a building on the west side with windows that looked out over the Hudson River and filled with light in the afternoon in a way that made the work feel, on most days, like it was being done in the right direction. The firm was not large to begin with. It did not need to be large. It needed to be real, which was a different qualification. And it was real from the first week, because Serena had spent 11 years learning the difference between a structure that looked sound and a structure that was sound. And she built this one from the second category. The practice focused on investment and legal strategy support for women-led businesses and family-owned companies that traditional finance consistently passed over. Not because they were not viable, but because they did not fit the profile that traditional finance had decided was the only shape viability came in. Serena understood profile problems. She understood what it meant to be assessed by a category rather than by the actual content of what you had built, and she brought that understanding to every client meeting with the particular usefulness of someone who had learned it through sustained experience rather than theory. She hired 4 people in the first quarter. One of them was a financial analyst named Maya, whose previous employer had spent 3 years taking credit for her work in client presentations, which was information Serena had learned in the second interview and had not found surprising. Maya was, as Serena had suspected from the first interview, exceptionally good at her job. Her name appeared on everything she produced. The office had a small conference table, not a large one. Serena had been deliberate about that. Large conference tables communicated a certain kind of authority. The authority of the room, the authority of accumulated institutional weight, the sense that decisions made here carried the gravity of the space itself. She had worked in rooms with large conference tables for 11 years and understood what they were for. She wanted something different here. She wanted a table where you could see who was across from you without needing to project, where the work in front of you was close enough to touch, where the distance between people in the room was the honest distance. In March, she received a call from James Whitmore, who wanted to discuss the possibility of Romano Holdings engaging Holloway Strategic Capital for ongoing legal and financial strategy consultation. He was careful about how he framed it. Not a favor, not a gesture, but a legitimate business need, a company that required the specific combination of skills that her firm offered, and that had, as he put it, reason to want those skills provided by someone whose judgment they had reason to trust. She thought about it for 3 days. She called Whitmore back on the 4th day and said yes, with conditions. The conditions were specific, documented, and non-negotiable. Full transparency on all matters presented to the firm, no request that implicated Serena's authorization status in any current or future federal proceeding, and a retainer agreement that named Holloway Strategic Capital as an independent contractor with no fiduciary relationship to any individual member of the Romano family. She was working for the company, not for the family. Whitmore said the conditions were acceptable. She wrote them into the contract herself. On a Thursday evening in late April, 6 months after a Sunday lunch on Long Island, Serena was at her desk finishing a filing when Daniel knocked on the open office door. He had taken to stopping by without calling first, which was a habit she was choosing to find unremarkable rather than significant, because making it significant gave it more weight than a Tuesday afternoon visit between two people who lived 20 blocks apart and were attempting the ordinary practice of being in each other's lives again. He sat in the chair across the desk and did not say anything for a moment, which was also a habit she recognized. The habit of a person who had spent 11 years in his own company and had not entirely lost the preference for silence as a form of being present. "The OPR investigation is moving to the formal charge phase," he said finally. "I got the notification this morning." She looked up from the filing. "How do you feel about that?" He considered it. His hand was on the arm of the chair, relaxed, the old restlessness in his body quieter than it had been in November, the managed quality of someone who is no longer living inside a state of sustained threat. "Like it's the right outcome," he said, "and like right outcomes don't always feel as conclusive as you think they're going to." He paused. "Like both of those things can be true at the same time." "They can," she said. He looked at the windows. The Hudson was visible in the late April light, the water going silver and the New Jersey shore just visible on the far side, and the sky doing what the sky did over a city at the end of the day, which was turn every color it could find in the time it had before it went dark. "I've been thinking about what you said in the cab that night," he said, "about there being time for the rest of it." She set her pen down. "Is there?" he said. Not dramatically. "Just the question, ask plainly, in the voice of a man who has learned to ask plain questions because the alternative has cost him more than he can spend again." She looked at her brother across the small, honest conference table that was her desk. The man who had been dead for 11 years and was sitting alive in a chair in her office on a Thursday evening in April, with the Hudson out the window and the light going and everything that had been broken between them still in various states of being repaired, which was the condition things were in when the people doing the repairing were still present and still trying. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He looked back at the window. She picked up her pen and went back to the filing, and they stayed like that for a while. Her working, him watching the water, the light changing the way it changed whether anyone was watching or not, the city going about the enormous ordinary business of being a city, indifferent and continuous and full of people carrying things they had survived. Later, she locked the office and they walked out together onto the West Side Street, and the river was dark now, and the lights on the Jersey shore were reflected in it in the way that looked less like reflection and more like the lights had been there all along, underneath, waiting for the dark to make them visible. She did not have a plan for what came next beyond the next thing. The firm, the clients, the work, which was real, and hers, and bore her name without apology or erasure. Her brother walking beside her at a pace that had nothing urgent in it. A city that did not know or care what she had survived, and therefore asked nothing from her but the simple willingness to keep moving through it. She kept moving. The river walked with them south, dark and continuous, carrying everything that had been put into it, and giving none of it back. The way rivers do. The way survival does. The way all the long, difficult work of becoming someone the architecture never made room for eventually does. Holding what it holds, releasing nothing, moving always in the direction of something larger than itself. She walked into it. She did not look back.